the Israel Defense Forces has eliminated the spokesperson for Hamas, and that is because, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said repeatedly during the early stages of this war, every member of Hamas has a target on his back. Not merely the terrorists who are fighting and launching terror attacks against members of the Israel Defense Forces, but the political wing of Hamas, certainly the spokesperson's wing of Hamas, as we've just seen it, Hamas domestically inside the Gaza Strip, and of course Hamas internationally, such as Ismail Haniyeh, who was dispatched, people will recall, by what is mooted to have been an intelligence attack undertaken by the Israeli security forces. So this is in keeping with a clear policy stated and outlined by Prime Minister Netanyahu. Every single member of Hamas has a target on his back, rightfully so. And it's also in keeping with a long-standing policy of Israel to eliminate non-combatant members of the Hamas organization. I want to give you an example of that. Just a couple of days ago, Ismail Barhoum, who was the acting prime minister of Hamas, he was eliminated inside the Gaza Strip. He had only been in situ for a period of 5 days. So Israel is intensifying its attacks on non-combatant members of the Hamas terror organization. And if one looks back further afield, one will realize that Sheikh Yassin, who was the spiritual leader of Hamas, he was eliminated on March 22nd, 2004. His successor was Abdel Aziz al-Rantisi, who took over once Yassin was targeted for elimination. Al-Rantisi survived until April 17th, 2004, less than a month later. So Israel has gone back to its policy of eliminating Hamas's leadership and then eliminating those who seek to fill the vacuum left by the elimination of these terrorist organizers. I think that people should recognize that the gathering of intelligence inside the Gaza Strip has been particularly painstaking and time-consuming as a consequence of the fact that Israel withdrew from Gaza in its entirety in 2005. And as a result of that, it placed far less of an emphasis on what would be called human intelligence or green intelligence, intelligence that is gathered from being on the ground in a given area. Now, it's not that Israel didn't have any on-the-ground intelligence capabilities inside Gaza during the years between the withdrawal in 2005 and the October 7th massacre in 2023. But Israel had certainly placed greater emphasis on signals intelligence, cyber intelligence, and other intelligence bases in addition to those. Now, during the course of the war, Israel has removed many thousands of jihadist terrorists from the battlefields in Gaza. The interrogations that have taken place inside Israel as those individuals have been taken off the battlefield, those interrogations are yielding greater intelligence than we once had. And it's on that intelligence, among other intelligence capabilities, that the IDF is now able to act with great accuracy and with near impunity, incidentally, when it comes to eliminating the leadership of Hamas. There is growing civil unrest inside the Gaza Strip, and we are seeing that manifested in the protests that are bubbling up and taking place throughout the Gaza Strip in cities such as Jabalia, Khan Younis, and elsewhere. And the call of the protesters is for the removal and the ouster of Hamas. Now, that is the result of the ongoing offensive and the increasing intensity of the offensive that the IDF is in the midst of inside the Gaza Strip in order to drive Hamas back to the negotiating table with a view to achieving one of the central war goals, namely the return and the release of all of the hostages that were captured by Hamas during the October 7th massacre in 2023. Now, when Israel and Hamas agreed to a pause in the fighting, Hamas made haste to show that they were still very much in charge of the Gaza Strip. That was a show of force that they wanted to project not only to Israel as an act of defiance, but also to Gazans themselves, to show that Hamas still ruled the day, had survived this war. That projection of strength has not met with confidence among the Gazan people, because the Gazan people are again moving from areas to which they had recently returned during the course of the ceasefire, because the Israel Defense Forces is now targeting and eliminating Hamas terror operatives, the political branch of Hamas, even spokespersons for Hamas. And as the Gazans are feeling the result of Israel's repeated justified offensive inside Gaza, their ire is beginning to be directed, rightly so, at the party responsible for their immiseration, namely Hamas. So the Israel Defense Forces has actually taken a very interesting viewpoint when it comes to the protests in Gaza, namely the chief of the general staff, so that's the chief commander of the Israel Defense Forces, newly minted as such, Lieutenant General Eliel Zamir, gave a command to all officers of the Israeli Defense Forces that they were not to pass any comment whatsoever on the significance of these uprisings in Gaza, lest Hamas should take Israeli statements and use them in order to turn the crowd back toward favoring the terror organization that rules the Gaza Strip. I will tell you one other thing about what's taking place there. People may be aware of the fact that Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is essentially an understudy of Hamas in terms of its military capabilities inside the Gaza Strip, launched 2 rockets towards Israel yesterday. It did that because when the terrorist organizations in Gaza launch rockets towards Israel, the Israeli Defense Force is bound to respond militarily. Palestinian Islamic Jihad knew that demonstrations within the Gaza Strip were going to start targeting Palestinian Islamic Jihad strongholds. And in order to prevent the crowds and the masses from coming towards those strongholds, the PIJ was willing to fire rockets into Israel in order to get a response from Israel, which would then keep the crowd at bay inside Gaza. So it's a very interesting dynamic to see. Make no mistake about it, Hamas is an enfeebled terror organization. Prior to October 7th, Hamas had been redefined by the Israel Defense Forces, no less, as not being a terror organization, but in fact a terror army. It is no longer a terror army. In fact, it's almost no longer a terror organization, precisely because it has been decimated by the actions and the operations of the Israel Defense Forces. It is something of a guerrilla force, however, and as a guerrilla force, though it has been, of course, severely downgraded in terms of its military and terror potency, it does nonetheless exist in some form, in a reduced form and in a weakened form. So we're going to continue to see efforts by Hamas to launch hostilities against Israel, but they are in no way, shape, or form able to do so in a sustained manner. They're in no way, shape, or form able to do so in an organized manner. And one of the aspects that strengthened Hamas was the encirclement of Israel by other Iranian proxies. So we saw, for example, the threat that Hezbollah had posed for many years in southern Lebanon toward Israel. We saw that Hezbollah was seeking to entrench itself in southern Syria as well, incidentally with some success. Hezbollah has also been neutered of late, and so Hamas cannot count on the threat of Hezbollah joining the fray in the manner that it once could prior to October the 7th. So it's not only enfeebled in terms of its command and control structure, in terms of its organizational capabilities, and in terms of its terror capabilities, it's also enfeebled because other Iranian proxies are no longer anywhere close to as potent as once they were. Iran's unveiling of a missile city and claiming that it holds greater potency than prior to Operation True Promise 2, which was the operation that took place on October the 1st, 2024, during the course of which Iran launched some 200 ballistic missiles from its sovereign territory toward Israeli sovereign territory. That claim is to show that while Iran's proxies have been decimated, downgraded, and weakened in terms of what they can launch against Israel, the head of the octopus, Iran, yet remains intact and yet remains a potent threat. But the reality of the matter is that Iran was shown by operations such as Operation True Promise 2 to be something of a paper tiger in my estimations. Without its terror proxies, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and southern Syria, without its terror proxy, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad having any potency, serious potency inside the Gaza Strip, Iran is required to lean upon its missile capabilities. And those missile capabilities were showed and rendered by Israel to be largely impotent. They were not able to wreak the type of damage that had been anticipated against Israeli civilians, civilian infrastructure, or the Israeli military. So I believe that Iran is frightened. I believe that Iran understands that it is acting from a very weak position indeed. And I would suggest that the real threat that one might see the Iranians try to carry out is a threat against softer targets than the States of Israel, namely perhaps Jewish communities abroad who have less hardened defenses, less capabilities, and fewer capabilities against terrorist cells and organizations that may well be working in areas such as Europe, Central and South America, and even incidentally, potentially making the effort to work against the Jewish community in North America. Iran is a paper tiger, it is weakened, and its blaster is not fooling anybody. With regard to the ongoing threat and the firing of ballistic missiles by the Houthis toward Israel's sovereign territory, I think that it behooves everybody to take a look back in recent history. In 1991, during the first Gulf War, people may well remember that Saddam Hussein, out of an act of retribution against the United States of America, began to launch Scud missiles against Israeli territory, particularly in the areas of Tel Aviv and in the areas of Haifa. I can recall being a child visiting Israel during that time, and for the first time hearing the word Patriot, and it referred to the air defense missiles that the Americans were deploying in order to interdict these Scads. But 43 Scud missiles did actually land in Israeli territory during that time, and that was the genesis for Israel's now vaunted and venerated air defense capabilities, which are leading the world, quite frankly, in the area of air defense, and we've seen deployed to great effect during the course of this war. With that having been said, one of the lessons learned from the first Gulf War was that Israel must not at any time outsource security of its skies to any third party, including its great friend and ally, the United States of America. And so whilst you do have the United States ramping up their attacks against the Houthis in Yemen, anybody who read the signal exchange that became the possession of the Atlantic journalist Jeffrey Goldberg some days ago will notice that there is discord within the Trump administration, incidentally perfectly legitimate discord and debate about how entrenched the Americans should become with regard to the Houthi threat, particularly the threat they pose to shipping lanes and international commerce. In the event that the voices of dissent against American participation against the Houthis should win the day, one will see that Israel will become ever more required to be vigilant and to take very decisive action against the Houthis, because the situation that we saw in Israel at 1 o'clock in the afternoon today, whereby 2 ballistic missiles were fired toward Israeli territory and drove millions of Israelis into shelters as a consequence, that situation is not tenable. I do not expect it to be tolerated by Israel, and indeed it must not be tolerated by Israel. So again, Israel must not outsource its air defense capabilities to anybody, including the United States of America.